Здравствуйте, уважаемые телезрители.
Hello, dear viewers. My dear comrades, the leaders of the Siberian Institute of Conceptual Analytics asked me to prepare a program about Joseph Vissarionovich Stalin. The fact is that you and I live in the kingdom of crooked mirrors, in a distorted world. We live in a time when there is distortion concerning the concepts and ideas on many events. The book by Edgar Morin on the nature of the USSR, called The Totalitarian Complex of the USSR, was published in 1983. This book is preceded by the following epigraph. Stalin did not walk away into the past, he dissolved into the future, no matter how this may sadden many. What is the significance of this quote? Today, many politicians, historians, and writers turn towards the personality of Joseph Vissarionovich Stalin. You probably noticed that before Perestroika, during the stagnation period, Stalin's name was hardly mentioned. In general, after what is known as Khrushchev's thaw, when Stalin was accused of a personality cult, somehow the talk about Stalin stopped, and the whole thing was hushed up. From the beginning of Perestroika, within the first years, this topic was also hushed up. But then they began to talk about Stalin more and more. So Edward Rodzinski wrote the interesting book, Stalin, Life and Death. William Pokhlopkin wrote the book, The Great Pseudonym. That is, both Democrats and oppositionists turned to the personality of Stalin. Why? The thing is that the time of Stalin's reign itself differs from the rest of the period of building socialism in our country. Differs how? Prices fell, wages rose, the country won the Second World War, the well-being of the people grew, the national economic complex was built and developed. All this, like many other things, was not ideologically correspondent to the times after Stalin concerning the development of society. Now the following mantra is being hammered into the heads of the youth. Stalin bury a gulag. Unfortunately, our youth knows very little about Stalin. We are being imposed with the idea that facts are stubborn things. Actually, facts are very flexible. As the Russian proverb goes, you are Yerema, I am Foma. You tell me one word, I tell you two. So often, in contrast to some facts, other facts can be presented, which in turn can be opposed by some other facts, and so on. So the Jew, Israel Moiseyevich Meter, put this Russian proverb into academic form. In the novel The Fifth Corner, he said, I have a lot of facts. I have enough facts. I am fed up with facts. But I am methodologically poor. And this is the circle around which we, meaning the Jews, occupy a perimeter defense and shoot back to the last bullet, which implies the last bullet for themselves. Therefore, it's easier to approach the consideration of Stalin's personality with the understanding of Alexander Sergeyevich Pushkin. Pushkin has such a verbal formula that provides a methodology for an approach to understanding ongoing processes. He said, Providence is not algebra. The human mind, as the folk expression goes, is not a prophet but a conjecturer. It sees the general cause of things and can deduce from it profound suppositions, often justified by time. But it cannot foresee chance, that powerful and instantaneous instrument of providence. And it is from the standpoint of the general cause of things that one must look into the period of Stalin's rule over the USSR, his actions, and the politics he was carrying out. Look, after the reign of Vladimir Lenin, Stalin came to power in a country which was already in disaster, an impoverished peasant country. And by the end of Stalin's reign, the USSR was a superpower. One could argue endlessly over whether the USSR was superpower number 1 or number 2, but everyone agrees that it was a superpower. This is a fact accepted by everyone. To say it differently, under the leadership of Joseph Vissarionovich Stalin, the USSR achieved successes thanks to which Russia still exists. As for Stalin's personal belongings, hardly anything was left behind. What's more, according to available data, there were 7,000 tons of gold in a concentrate located somewhere in the Urals region, which Churchill talked about regarding the Lend-Lease aid. So it turns out that Stalin, a man who created a mighty superpower, personally led a very modest lifestyle. His daughter ended her days in a nursing home in Canada, and his granddaughter still works there as a waitress. Now, if we compare the activities of Stalin with the activities of the current governors of the country, who recently left the stage, some of whom still continue their democratic activities, then I think the conclusion for every one of the viewers will be obvious. So, who was Stalin? Many people ask questions about who Stalin really was. Leader, genius, totalitarian, tyrant, maniac, or a jrets. I am now going to read you a poem that goes like this. From house to house he wandered, knocking at silent doors, his ancient oak and panduri, voicing a motive pure. Within the melody's roulades, shining as pure sunstream, dwelt the unvanished wisdom, truth and the holy dream. Roused by the lonely chanting, war huts from a stone-cold sleep. Lingering in the shadows, flame flew above the trees. People who cherished darkness turned from the godly trail, poured no mere wine but poison into his holy grail. Strange are thy words and thy chanting, truth of yours foreign in sound. Drink till your cup is empty, curse you, exclaimed the crowds. Who is the author of this poem? Hardly anybody knows that this poem was written by Stalin when he was only 17-18 years old. Why am I saying this? In fact, it is known, and scientists recognize this, that the character of a person as a whole, his abilities, his worldview, his nervousness, are formed before the ages of 12 to 14 years. After this age, changes in the person in the mentioned regard are minimal. There are, of course, statistically rare exceptions, but for the majority of people, for the rest of their lives, everything that was laid down in their psyche during childhood remains for the most part unchanged. So each one of you yourselves answer this question. Could a young man who wrote such poems at a youthful age be a scoundrel, a bastard, a person with evil intentions, motivated to do evil against people? I think the answer should be obvious. There is also the opinion that Stalin was ignorant, illiterate, uncultured, and poorly educated. This is also a distorted mirror. Stalin received a rather good for the times education. He was educated at a seminary, from where he graduated with excellent marks almost in all subjects. He had only one below excellent mark. Stalin knew the Bible very well. And from the previous lectures, we already know that the Bible is, in general, the doctrine of governance over countries and nations. It is the doctrine of governance over the entire biblical civilization. One of Stalin's teachers was a famous mystic of the time, Georgy Ivanovich Gurdjieff. According to Gurdjieff himself, he was born on the night of December the 31st to January the 1st. The year of the birth is not known. There are such versions as 1866, 1872, 1874, 1877. He was born in Alexandropol, now Gyumri, Armenia, and died on October the 29th, 1949 in France. He was a spiritual teacher, writer, composer, traveler, and forced immigrant whose activities were devoted to the self-development of a person, the growth of man's consciousness, and being in everyday life, and whose teaching among his followers was called the Fourth Way. What I mean to say is that Stalin was familiar with mystical occult teachings. In addition, Stalin knew the Quran well. Stalin could speed read. He could read 500 pages in 2 hours and consciously perceive what he had read. He also did accounting courses. And since a lot of attention is paid to economics in the conception of social safety, I must say that, generally speaking, all economic science is based on the 4 operations of arithmetic. And the most accurate accounting is that very accounting with which Stalin was most well versed. Therefore, it enabled him to competently govern the national economic complex of the country. Well, and finally, Stalin's native language was Georgian, so he had to comprehend both the Bible and Marxism in Russian, which was not his mother tongue. He had to create his own images and understandings, translating them into his Georgian language. This is a generally big undertaking, and I want to emphasize that it requires a very serious understanding of the essence, since those who read in their native language may more easily lose or miss some details. That is, the consciousness of a native speaker may not mark some specificities of his own language. The one who delves into knowledge expressed not in his native language sharpens his attention and consciousness to the perception of this knowledge, and has to delve much deeper and more attentively into the details. As we have already said, Stalin's native language was Georgian, and he also spoke Russian. In addition, he knew Church Slavonic well from the seminary, and according to some researchers, he knew English and German, and also knew the ancient Greek language. He read Plato in the original. The notes he left in the books were in Hungarian and French. In addition to what was said, he understood the Armenian and Ossetian languages. Moreover, there is a version that Stalin's father was Nikolai Mikhailovich Prozhevalsky. This version has the right to exist because the time of Stalin's birth coincides with Prozhevalsky's lifespan. Moreover, Stalin's biography has been little studied. And there is one more thing that needs understanding. After all, how could such a kid from a poor family get such an education, find himself in Russia and in the Marxist movement? The fact is that Nikolai Mikhailovich Prozhevalsky was a general of intelligence of the Russian General Staff. But among the officers, especially of the Russian army, there is such an unspoken rule that when an officer dies, his children come under the auspices of fellow officers. So it can be assumed that such patronage was somehow carried out in relation to Joseph Vissarionovich Stalin. Therefore, the version that Stalin was deliberately introduced by the main intelligence directorate of the Russian army into the Marxist movement for the realization of certain objectives has the foundation to exist. As a result of training and education, Stalin turned out to be a highly qualified governor. All eyewitnesses who worked with him knew that he worked day and night, without any days off, assiduously. He knew all the developments carried out in the country, both of a military nature and of national economic importance. Moreover, he not only knew, but he tracked their results. He factually knew by their first and father's names all the governors of the country, all the chief design engineers, and even individual engineers and scientists. He delved into all spheres of society. He read a lot, 500 pages a day on average. It is well known that he conversed with many people of culture and art, and regularly visited the theater. That is, the opinion that Stalin was an ignorant, numb, uneducated person does not stand up to criticism. This is a lie and defamation, which is spread by bad people of all kinds. In reality, Stalin was a widely erudite, literate, and a highly qualified governor. How can one evaluate Stalin's activity from the standpoint of the general cause of things? The fact is that, at the end of the 19th century, the global financial mafia, which in the terminology of the conception of social safety is called the global predictor, realized that capitalism took the ban of the process of people's consumption of material goods, and the biogenic civilization that existed before that time began to move into a technocratic civilization. Resources of the earth began to be rapidly consumed, and the capitalist system allowed many people to increase their well-being. That is, such an intensive process of extraction and mastery over our planet began. And this global mafia knew that what would be consumed at an always accelerating pace would be very difficult to restore. So what does this mafia have to do? How to reduce the consumption of material goods by people? So it became very beneficial for them to shift the entire planet to the ideology of Marxism. Therefore, strong propaganda was provided to Marxist theory. In this respect, Russia was chosen as a starting mechanism, that is, brushwood for the permanent world revolution. Russia was conceived as a starting point to begin the process of the shift of all countries and nations to pseudo-communism. To implement this permanent revolution, a tandem of Vladimir Lenin with Leib Davidovich Bronstein, nicknamed Trotsky, was created. However, in essence, this tandem did not take place, since through the conclusion of the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk, Lenin stopped this process of the permanent revolution, for which he was removed from affairs and subsequently destroyed by the global predictor. So Trotsky was supposed to continue the work of this permanent revolution. However, referring again to Pushkin, but it cannot foresee chance, that powerful and instantaneous instrument of providence. And from above, the go-ahead for this was apparently not given. Therefore, Leib Trotsky fell ill, and the governance of the country was intercepted by Joseph Vissarionovich Stalin. Why did this happen? The fact is that all these Trotskyists are idle talkers, just like our Democrats now, and in order to work seriously, a thoughtful, laborious, modest person was needed. Stalin was that very kind of person. He was a hard worker, inconspicuous, did not know how to speak beautifully, so they were seduced by the thought that this modest secretary would follow their willpower, while they, fiery revolutionaries, would talk from the stands as our Democrats do now. But they miscalculated, and from 1924 to about 1934-37, Stalin was gaining strength. Why? Because there were only Trotskyists all over the country, and Stalin did not have his own personnel, so he had to work with those who were available. How to get out of this situation? It was necessary for him to create his own personnel base and eliminate the Trotskyist one that led the country to ruin. Stalin understood this, and he managed to split the Trotskyists. You know, there are such special technologies of self-eating. This is known to the special services, and Stalin actually possessed these technologies, since he knew the Quran well, and the Quran, Surah 6, Ayat 65 says, "He is able to send upon you an affliction from above you or from under your feet, or he can divide you into factions and make you taste the violence of one another." The elite are Trotskyists, and the entire elite, as you can see, this is happening now too. They all care about their own good, how to make more money, how to luxuriate. They are engaged in acquisitions and so on. Therefore, if some get more and others less, they will become jealous of each other and will rat out and betray each other. The elite are, generally speaking, the largest herd that can be governed. The elite themselves cannot do anything without a shepherd. Therefore, they have such a syndrome, loss of master. If we draw a parallel with the present day, then you see how the elite rush from one politician who is supposedly gaining strength, to another. Approximately the same was happening under Stalin. The elite themselves are incapable of anything. And Stalin fought against Jewry under the slogan of fighting Trotskyism. There are a lot of accusations addressed to Stalin concerning gulags, but after all, Jews were in charge of all the gulags, and it was Jews who ratted each other out, as a result of which they were sent to the gulags. And it was Jews who also worked in the ЧК, the All Russian Extraordinary Commission. All these lists of who needed to be sent to the gulags were also made by Jews. All this is a known fact. However, they put all the blame on Stalin alone. In parallel with the struggle, Stalin was creating a cadres base. Therefore, what this elite did to themselves, self-eating, they terribly hate Stalin for this. And the descendants of those fiery revolutionaries, children and grandchildren, mostly the latter, they of course terribly hate Stalin, because he was able to organize the process of detaching Trotskyism in the USSR from the world financial mafia. What's more, Stalin is also accused of collectivization. It is said that during collectivization there were excesses and so on. From the standpoint of the general cause of things, it looks like this. Look, socialism triumphed in one country. You remember that all-world imperialism went against the USSR and formed the Entente. Then there was that war. We won and defended our homeland. But this mafia did not come down. Stalin knew this, so it was necessary to create a powerful industrial base, a powerful industry in the country, that is, to develop a good military-industrial complex, to develop mechanical engineering. And where to get cadres for this case? Russia was a peasant country, so in the countryside. You probably know that many films were shot based on the motive that many people from villages enthusiastically went to build all kinds of hydroelectric power plants and other large industrial complexes. And how to feed this whole armada of people? That famine, a horse with a plow, it could not feed this armada. Consequently, an organized management of agriculture was required, which would make it possible to provide food for the country and this mass of people, who were engaged in the construction of the national economic and industrial complex of the country. So it turns out that collectivization was quite simply a necessary step, taken in the name of the development and prosperity of the country. And what are the Trotskyists doing? What is their method? The main method is to discredit, cause excesses, make it so that the line is crossed. Or, according to the strategy of the funny man and humorist Rykin, to elevate the ridiculous to the great, and the great to the ridiculous. Therefore, they went overboard with everything that was conceived, and again put all the blame on Stalin alone. Nevertheless, Stalin defeated Trotskyism in our country. He won the victory. He defeated political Trotskyism, but unfortunately, he could not defeat psychic Trotskyism, and above all, because he himself was susceptible to smoking and drinking alcohol. Drinking and smoking did not contribute to the defeat of psychic Trotskyism. If we talk about Trotskyism, then Trotskyism is Judaism adapted to modern conditions, and basically nothing else, because it is in the Bible, it is in the Torah, that the domination, the reigning of some people over others is affirmed. Under the leadership of Stalin, the victory in the Second World War was won. Very often, especially in recent times, people begin to compare Stalin with Hitler, putting them on the same level. This is another distortion. In the USSR, before the Second World War, Trotskyists and Stalinists struggled for their understanding of the Marxist-Leninist heritage. And the Stalinists won. In Germany, the Nazis, led by Hitler, and the communists, led by Talman, fought for the correct understanding and implementation of the word socialism, and the Nazis were victorious. But, generally speaking, symbolism is not important in this process. Each of these political movements had its own conception, mutually unacceptable to one another. Hitler defended the crowd elite system, that is, the domination of some people over others, and in this sense, he was no different from the biblical doctrine. That was why he was allowed to obtain all the potential of Europe's industrial, economic, and human potential, for the purpose of an attack on the USSR. The global predictor gave everything to Hitler in order for him to destroy the USSR, since Hitler was their man, their protege. Contrary to Adolf Hitler, Stalin's principles of democracy were opposed to the biblical doctrine of the crowd elite model of building society. Firstly, Stalin organized access to education for all citizens, for all stratums of the society. Education for everyone was free. And our grandmothers, grandfathers, great-grandmothers, great-grandfathers went to workers' schools, to universities, to institutions, and any child from a working-class background had the opportunity to receive a high level of education, while it is on the basis of incremental distribution of knowledge that the crowd elite society is supported. Another principle of Stalin's democracy was the elimination of the monopoly on governing labor. And Stalin, as you know from books and films, crushed the elite. Indeed, he held governors responsible for the quality of their work, a principle which is now completely absent in our country. Stalin held the governors responsible for the quality of their work, and thus were such successes achieved in the country. Another Stalinist principle of democracy was the elimination of monopolistically high prices for the products of governing labor, the monopolistically high cost of governing labor. It is known that under Stalin, the difference in salary between various social stratums was not so much. In Japan, for instance, the difference between the highest and the lowest wage in a company is approximately 5 times. In Germany, about 15 to 17 times. In the USA, about 30 to 50 times. Under Stalin, the minor's salary was higher than the salaries of some ministers. But the ministers, however, had indirect bonuses, like cars, daches, and so on. But, speaking of salaries, it was like that. Stalin understood the social significance of governing labor, and he created all the conditions necessary for the governing elite. But he also held them responsible. He strictly demanded results from them, so that they worked добросовестно for благо of the people and the country. So Stalin's principles of democracy have no place for the so-called race of masters. However, it must also be admitted that Stalin was not able to completely remove the crowd elite model of society. Continuing the comparison between Hitler and Stalin, we can state that Hitler indulged the crowd with slogans like, "I will give you everything," "I will conquer the whole world," "We will dominate," and he promised it now. While Hitler flirted with the crowd, Stalin governed skillfully for the people's prosperity, sometimes even causing discontent among the people. Why? Because Stalin's measure of understanding was much higher. He set a task before the Communist Party, compelling it not to indulge the crowds, but to lead people, to always be at the forefront of all events, that is, to foresee events. To put it differently, Stalin turned the crowd into people. In addition, under Stalin, friendship of peoples was purposefully formed within a multinational, multi-confessional country named the USSR. Adolf Hitler was a chieftain, a mob charmer, while Joseph Stalin was a Zhretz leader who worked for the future. Hitler told the truth when he spoke about the dominance of the Jewish usurer's capital in the life of the planet. He correctly asserted that since 1917, Russia had been enslaved by Jewry, that the Jewry was a global evil. But this was not the whole truth. Stalin also told the truth when he said that Hitlerism was a product of big business, and said that Hitlerism was a racial doctrine of domination of some people over others, where the governance of social processes was reduced to the boundaries of one nation. What I mean is that the extent to which Stalin and Hitler understood processes was different. Stalin was able to defeat Hitlerism, defeat fascism. I'd like to say a few words in relation with Chechnya and Stalin, who acted absolutely brilliantly to Chechnya at that time. You know that Chechnya, not all the people of course, wanted to go over to Hitler's side. They supported him. What to do in this case? In Chechnya, they have a tribal system. So the tribe had to become a nation. How to do it? For this, the tribal structure had to live among other people within 2 or 3 generations in order to become a nation. And this was implemented. If all that done by Stalin had carried on, then Chechnya in the form in which it exists today would not exist. But unfortunately, under Khrushchev, since 1956, Chechens had already begun to return to their places, to come back from all over the country, and returned again to the tribal form of state that led to such tragic events in the 90s. If we talk about the events that are taking place in particular in the Middle East, then after the war, it was Stalin who gave the go-ahead for the creation of the State of Israel. Why? Because Stalin understood the role of Jewry. The fact is that it was Stalin who gave the most accurate definition of nation. He said, "Nation is a historically formed commonality of people, united by the common territory, language, culture, psychological and economic arrangement of life. All this together makes a definition of nation. Jewry does not fall under this definition. And in contrast to Stalin's definition, there is the definition of Theodor Herzl, who said, "Nation is a group of people of the common historical past, joined together in the present against the existing enemy." So, it turns out that if there is an enemy, there is a nation. If there is no enemy, there is no nation. Generally speaking, intelligent Jews should not scold Stalin, but erect a monument to him and delve into his ideas, taking a thoughtful position. Now, what is happening between Palestine and Israel? After all, the global predictor understands that after the creation of the State of Israel, Jews became a nation, but were not spread anymore. But the global predictor does not need Jewry as a nation. They only need it as a tool to implement their plans to govern countries and nations on planet Earth, which we also know from the Bible. "And thou shalt reign over many nations, but they shall not reign over thee." And this is being instilled in Jewry in this sense. Jews are hostages of this mafia. In fact, Jewry is a tool of the global predictor, and when the tool does not work well, the global predictor destroys it. Returning to Hitler, he was solving a multifaceted task. One of his tasks was to unite Jewry, since it was under Stalin that Jewry began to get out of the control of this global mafia. However, it was necessary to keep them in obedience. That was what Hitler worked for. He intimidated them, thereby instilling in them, "You see, you are being destroyed. You must all stick together." Stalin knew and understood global politics. Here is another distortion. You and I are being told that politics can be internal and external. Internal domestic politics is politics pursued by the state in relation to its country and people, solving tasks within its country. External foreign politics is politics pursued by the state in relation to other states. And global politics is politics pursued by the state in relation to the entire planet Earth, in relation to all mankind. We are not told about this, although they are forced to let it slip. Look, now we are talking about anti-globalization actions. Dear viewers, ask yourselves a question. If there is anti-globalism, then is there globalism? And if there are anti-globalists, then are there globalists? What is globalism? And who are globalists? Nobody talks about this. We say that there is the global predictor. But how does the global predictor govern over countries and nations? So the global predictor carries out governance through conceptual power. There is such a story about Stalin, Churchill and Roosevelt when they met in Yalta. It is not proved that the story is true. Anyway, the meeting was about the redivision of Europe after the war. Churchill and Roosevelt asked Stalin, "Joseph Vissarionovich, give us Crimea, and we will give you a corresponding piece of land in Europe." Stalin thought and said, "Okay, I will give you Crimea, if you can guess which of these three fingers, thumb, forefinger and middle on my hand, is the middle one." Churchill was surprised at the simplicity of the riddle and chose this index finger. Stalin shook his head in the negative and said, "No, you haven't guessed." Roosevelt was more cunning, he was an American, and he realized that he had to choose among the five fingers, so he pointed to the middle one. Stalin again shook his head in the negative and said, "No, you haven't guessed. Here is Crimea," and showed them this gesture, which in Russian means that whatever you ask, you will get nothing. What is the essence of this story? In reality, it is not three types of power that exist: legislative, executive, judicial powers. In fact, there are five types of power. Ideological power is above legislative power, and the most important one is conceptual power. So Stalin had conceptual power, and he dealt with global politics, pursued in relation to all of humanity. Symbolic of the fact of his knowledge as to the existence of global politics, it was only two countries that did not join the IMF. These two countries were Switzerland and the USSR. It should be noted that this is very important. He was not the master of global politics, but he understood it and skillfully maneuvered, reacted, and adapted to global politics. For the fact that Stalin understood and reasonably acted in relation to global politics, he was respected. You know that he had indisputable authority at the international level, including even such figures as Churchill. When Stalin appeared in a room, Churchill involuntarily stood up. When Churchill was asked about the reasons for this behavior, he answered with ignorance. That is, he himself did not understand why he involuntarily stood up before Stalin. So Stalin was respected all over the world. Oppositionists of the Marxist persuasion do not quite consciously appeal to Stalin, although Stalin in fact was never Marxist. This is also one of the crooked mirrors distortion that needs to be straightened. Stalin factually pronounced the death sentence on Marxism when in 1952 he made a speech at one of the last plenums, and these thoughts of his were reflected in the work Economic Problems of Socialism in the USSR, where he actually signed the death sentence on Marxism. He said, setting the task for our society and scientists. Further, I think that we must also discard certain other concepts taken from Marxist Capital, where Marx was concerned with an analysis of capitalism and artificially applied to our socialist relations. I am referring to such concepts among others as necessary and surplus labor, necessary and surplus product, necessary and surplus time. Marx analyzed capitalism in order to elucidate the source of exploitation of the working class, surplus value, and to arm the working class, which was bereft of means of production, with an intellectual weapon for the overthrow of capitalism. If these concepts, necessary product and surplus product, necessary labor and surplus labor, are removed from Marxist political economy, then nothing will remain of Marxist political economy. In fact, he set the task of terminological and conceptual demarcation between communism and Marxism. But he himself could not carry out all this, because he was in captivity of Marxist-Leninist phraseology. However, the conception of social safety contains all that. The following question is often asked: why did Stalin not leave behind a successor? And the answer lies right here. Just imagine. Stalin operated with images. That is, he understood and saw this crowd elite model, global politics, as well as all the other elements. But he could not express all this in words. After all, the terminological apparatus was of Marxist, according to which there is no crowd elite society, but there is a class struggle. What kind of class struggle is this? What kind of struggle between peasants and workers? This is exactly the crowd elite model of governance. Stalin acted reasonably, unconsciously, feeling how to act appropriately to the given situation. But terminologically, he was enclosed in the Marxist-Leninist phraseology. When Stalin passed away, everyone else turned out to be dumb, because they were in captivity of the Marxist-Leninist phraseology and terminological apparatus. For the first time in the history of mankind, the history from the alternative to the biblical conception standpoints, where there is no place for the race of masters, is described in the conception of social safety. But in general, if we evaluate Stalin's actions, then we will see that he gave rise to the formation of a new culture of mankind, the culture that, in the terminology of the conception of social safety, is called anti-crowd elitism, which is described in detail and endowed with a precise measure of understanding, and in which a conceptual terminological apparatus is given. What is going on now? How to reconcile the period of Stalinism, the period of Stalin's governing, with what is happening now? Now, the global predictor is again trying to bring Trotskyism to Russia, to replace the temporarily implanted bourgeois democracy. The global predictor did not intend to build any capitalism or bourgeois democracy. In the understanding of the global predictor, this was just a transitional phase of perestroika from a pseudo-socialist society to a new pseudo-socialist society. So, speaking in terms of the apparatus of the conception of social safety, we made the path from one Trotskyism to another Trotskyism through bourgeois democracy. To say it differently, they want to make an expanded Israel out of Russia. And this is being done quietly. Pay attention, look around after this lecture, and think for yourselves. Everything is criticized, all various points of view are considered, but neither Trotsky nor especially Karl Marx is criticized. They do not touch Marxism. Many monuments have been removed and so on, but the monuments to Marx stand where they have always stood. Why? Because they need him, and hence all the ensuing consequences in relation to all political parties that are enclosed in Marxism. However, they will not succeed in this venture, since the global predictor has lost governance over social processes on planet Earth. That is, in their governance over countries and nations. The global predictor has lost stability in terms of predictability. Their governance is losing stability. This happens in connection with the changed informational state, the law of time, according to which the standards of the frequencies of social and genetic time have changed. I mean that social time, the rate of renewal of knowledge and technology, overtook genetic time, but it became equal precisely during the reign of Stalin. So Stalin had a very difficult time when governing the country, when the rates of informational renewal at the genetic and non-genetic levels coincided. The Almighty is never mistaken, and it is a blessing for the country that such a person as Stalin governed Russia at that time. So, after the changed informational state, the global predictor objectively began losing governance in terms of predictability. Look, the global predictor decided to remove the accumulated issues in society as a result of their own governance through the permanent revolution. Generally speaking, in their opinion, there are three global issues on the planet. There are a lot of people on the planet, therefore at least half of humanity is considered excessive today. And they believe that excessive people should disappear. In their opinion, about 2 or 3 billion people should remain on Earth. The second issue is raw material reserves on the planet Earth, which must be taken under control, since they are not inexhaustible. The ecology has been brought to such a state that you won't find clean water from the tap. Soon we will buy clean air. Therefore, the global predictor is solving these three issues. At the beginning of the last century, they already knew that these issues were brewing. And then they decided to solve them through the permanent revolution, but in response they received Stalinism. How to fight Stalinism? They decided to fight Stalinism with Hitlerism, but in return they got the socialist camp. However, without realizing what Stalinism was, they began to fight against the personality of Stalin. They slandered him from head to toe, made all sorts of nasty films, wrote books, staged all sorts of restructuring, perestroika, but in reply they received the conception of social safety. This is the conception of a global significance, and in contrast to Stalin, who acted intuitively, it is endowed with a clear terminological apparatus. That is, it is set out in strict lexical forms. The root of the conception of social safety is the philosophical and worldview prism of the triunity of MIM, matter, information, measure, and the core of the conception of social safety is the sufficiently general theory of governance. Today, the global predictor is really losing governance, and this must be understood. In this regard, one must also understand the difference between the politicians of Stalin's times and today's politicians in Russia. What is the difference? Stalin did not have to voice his conception. This did not have to be done. Why? Because it would have been inscribed in the terminological and conceptual apparatus of Marxism-Leninism, and the people would not have understood what Stalin was saying. As for modern politicians, they cannot pursue their conception on double standards, when information by announcement is different from information by default. Why? Due to the law of time, which we have talked about many times. Moreover, an attempt to act on the basis of double standards and by default leads to the opposite effect. According to the law of time, everything secret becomes apparent, often quite quickly. And how does this happen? Remember how everyone was happy with Gorbachev. They said that Gorbachev is smart, he speaks without written paper, he's young, and so on. Well, where is this Gorbachev now? Rose up and fell down. Then the people shouted out, "Yeltsin, Yeltsin! He fights bureaucrats." And how did this all end up? He rose up and fell down, and everyone wanted to put Yeltsin's gang in jail. Now, when the process of concentration of governance towards productive forces of humanity, that is, globalization, is completed without presenting one's own global politics, nothing will come of it. So, the conception has to be announced, and there are only two conceptions. Either we live under a race of masters according to the biblical conception, when some reign over others, or we live according to the different conception when all people live in harmony with each other, when they live according to previousness. For the implementation of the second option, the conception of social safety was created. In fact, people have always dreamt of such a conception. They just could not express it lexically. So, it existed in legends, tales, epics, proverbs. And in this sense, the conception of social safety does not carry any discoveries. Just what has always existed and what has always been known in one way or another, fragmentarily, unholistically, has become a systemic integrity and obtained exactness of forms and terminological apparatus. Well, and finally, the last thing I would like to say in this program is to draw a certain parallel between Stalin and Putin. There are three types of governor. The first type is when the measure of the governor's understanding is much higher than the measure of his team's understanding. The second type is when the measure of the governor's understanding is at the same level as the measure of his team's understanding. The third one is when the measure of the governor's understanding is lower than the measure of his team's understanding. You can correlate these variants to any leaders of parties, enterprises, states, and so on. As for Stalin, his measure of understanding was much higher than the measure of understanding of the people around him. Yes, he consulted with others, but he made all decisions on his own, based on his higher measure of understanding. Vladimir Putin, just like Stalin, has a significantly greater measure of understanding than the people around him. We know for sure that he really listens to everyone, but after that he makes his own speech, but not what he was recommended. And in this sense, his surroundings are in panic. As for Yeltsin, he made those speeches which were written for him and always used the prepared paper. Gorbachev did the same, but Putin is sharply different from them. So, in negotiations with Bush, Putin outsmarted him. Why? Because Bush's level of understanding is much lower than his advisors. Bush has strong advisors. Bush acted in a formulaic manner, according to a certain program. As for Putin, he always acts depending on the situation, which requires creative skills, and which is logical, some impromptu, and due to his higher level of understanding, he outsmarted Bush. Another parallel. Stalin came from a family of simple workers. You know, his mother was a simple worker, his father was a shoemaker. Stalin had a difficult childhood, his family lived in poverty. Putin is also from a simple family, and this is important, because the worldview that is formed in childhood, as I said, leaves an imprint for the rest of one's life. If you read the book about Putin, you will see how he describes his childhood. He really had a difficult childhood. This is where Putin stands in stark contrast to all our other leaders. Look, Gorbachev, Yeltsin, Yakovlev, the architect of perestroika, they were all from kulak families, rich families. And this kulak past acts in all of them and has had an imprint on their behavior. All of them pursued vile politics, like Gorbachev, who committed a vileness. Remember how he said that he wanted to destroy the old system, so he did it. How did Stalin come to power? I have already said that Stalin was appointed because he was a modest, inconspicuous, gray, executive, disciplined person, and they thought that they would command him. And how did Putin come to power, remember? The same thing concerns Yeltsin's clan. The family chose for a long time whom to assign. They tried, tested different candidates for loyalty, obedience, and so on. And Putin is also inconspicuous, executive, not a chatterbox, disciplined. He followed all instructions. In both cases, the elites miscalculated. The elite was openly afraid of Stalin. They still blame him for what happened. The current elite are also grinding their teeth against Putin. Why? They did not expect him to get out of their control. After all, you see how skillfully he builds politics. He understands that now it is a hard time in the country. So he first got stronger at the international level, carrying out certain global politics, so far available to him, in order to implement certain plans. Having established himself sufficiently at the international level, he began to solve problems within the country. Generally speaking, he acts very reasonably, and the elite is uniting in their hatred of Putin. Now we must attentively observe, because the processes in the country are very serious. Going back to Stalin, he made the USSR strong. It was superpower number 1 or number 2. It depends on how you look at the things. In the terms of the rate of economic growth, Stalin's USSR was superpower number 1. Putin has so far begun to create the image of a strong state. But those who understand the worldview of the triunity of MIM know that if there is an image, information, and if it is endowed with an exact measure, then the third, matter, will definitely come. If we draw the following parallel, we will see that Stalin was shackled by Marxism, the terminology of Marxism, but he acted reasonably according to the current situation. Putin is now, in the same way, shackled by many chains, all sorts of rituals conditioned by the church and by something else. But many do not understand this. He is really shackled by many things flowing in society. He is a hostage of the system. But he acts reasonably according to the current situation. He does not say many things, but he actually implements what is set out in the conception of social safety. This also applies to education. Take a look. After all, he spoke allegorically about the law of time in Novosibirsk. He said that it makes no sense to increase the terms of education. It is necessary to provide a methodology. Education should be available to all strata of the society. Recently, he held negotiations with the IMF and refused to obtain a loan from them. In addition, he returned the anthem of the USSR, not yet in full, but nevertheless he returned it. So, Putin, like Stalin, acts reasonably according to the current situation. Well, and finally, the last parallel. Stalin once said, "Cadres determine everything." It is actually true. We live not the way we work, but the way we are governed. Therefore, Stalin prepared his corps of governors for a long time, seriously. He was rebuilding himself from Trotskyism. Therefore, a great deal of attention is paid to Trotskyism in the conception of social safety, not only as a political phenomenon, but above all a psychological phenomenon. And without understanding what Trotskyism is, which as a psychological phenomenon in the history of mankind has always existed, one simply cannot understand what is happening. Putin now, as was the case with Stalin, does not have his own team either. All around there are only Trotskyists. At the top there are the right Trotskyists, and the entire opposition makes up the left Trotskyists. For clarity, Let's take a quick look at some of the parallels that are visible between Stalin and Putin, and which we have mentioned in this video. If we judge about family and childhood, then both, as you can see, grew up in a family of simple workers. Both had a difficult childhood. Both experienced certain needs. Both came to power in the same way. Both were quiet, modest, disciplined, non-talkative, executive. So they bet on him and miscalculated. The measure of understanding of each of them was and is significantly higher than their teams and of the political surroundings. There are some differences in relation with the elite's ability to oppose each of them. The elite of Stalin's time, due to the political system, had objectively fewer such opportunities than today's elite. This is connected, among other things, to the fact that there was an ideology in the USSR of Stalin, and on its basis it was possible to justify one's own non-systemic, non-Marxist decision, which in essence ideologically limited the elite. As for ideology in modern Russia, any ideology is legally prohibited, so there is no motivated basis on which to justify one's non-systemic decision. That is, the elite is in essence not limited by anything in its counteraction and sabotage. So Putin has to maneuver in harsher conditions. Stalin managed to build a superpower that has never been equal in history in very many ways. However, there was no theory, the absence of which Stalin repeatedly spoke of. For this reason, the global predictor managed to lead the country away from the previous course of development. As for Putin, his reign is not over yet, so it is too early to judge his results. But it is important to say that despite the difficult ideological situation, the country has the theory that Stalin wanted. Moreover, Putin knows this theory, although he cannot say it directly. And this is the theory of the conception of social safety.